Welcome to the Deep Dive Podcast. Straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. Robert Johnson here.
And I'm Linda Miller. We cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, let's dive into this. So there was this significant meeting planned in London.
Right. Foreign ministers, UK, US, France, Germany, Ukraine, all about a peaceful settlement.
Yeah, exactly. But it's been called off. That's the latest news.
Called off. Any reason given?
It seems the U.S. Secretary of State couldn't make it. Scheduling conflict, apparently.
Interesting timing. But are parts of it still happening?
Yes, actually. The UK and Ukrainian foreign ministers, they're still expected to meet bilaterally there in London.
Okay, so not a complete washout. Direct talks still on the table between some key players.
Right. But here's where it gets, well, quite complex. Yeah. This cancellation follows some pretty significant reports.
From the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal.
Suggesting the U.S. is actually considering, well, recognizing Crimea as Russian territory.
Wow. Okay, that's a major potential shift, considering the history there.
Absolutely. And it makes sense then. You hear President Zelensky being very clear, Ukraine will not recognize the peninsula as part of Russia.
Well, yeah, I mean, from Ukraine's perspective, that's fundamental. But Russia's view, stemming from that 2014 referendum...
Well, they reported, 96.77% voted for reunification?
Exactly. And President Putin considers that issue completely closed. So U.S. recognition would be huge.
Definitely. So instead of the Secretary of State, the president's special envoy will represent the U.S. in London now.
And didn't the Wall Street Journal also mention something else about London and Paris?
They did. That London and Paris are maybe considering the possibility of Ukraine losing some territories.
Okay, so that adds another layer. Are key European allies starting to think about potential territorial concessions for Ukraine?
It certainly raises that question, doesn't it? What kind of pressure might Kyiv be under?
So where does Ukraine stand right now amidst all this shifting ground?
Well, President Zelensky announced just yesterday, I believe, that the Ukrainian team going to London has a specific mandate.
A mandate for what exactly?
To discuss a ceasefire. Could be unconditional or even partial. It shows Kyiv is ready to talk about that specific stage.
Right, so focusing on stopping the immediate fighting, perhaps, even if the bigger issues remain unresolved. Tactical flexibility, maybe?
Could be. And remember, there was that meeting in Paris just last week, April 17th.
Ukraine, U.S., France.
Yes. And apparently the U.S. presented its settlement plan there, including the Crimea issue.
So the U.S. plan, with that controversial element, is already out there.
Seems so. But then Axios reported something slightly different.
Oh, what was that?
The Kyiv's plan for London wasn't necessarily to dive into the whole U.S. plan, but to focus on securing a 30-day truce first.
Ah, okay. So maybe a disconnect in priorities. U.S. looking at the big picture, Kyiv focusing on an immediate pause.
It looks that way. It's quite a complex diplomatic picture. The State Department even told Russia about the Paris talks.
Really? They briefed Moscow.
Yeah. And Putin's aide, Ushakov, mentioned they expect another visit from the U.S. Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff.
Witkoff again? Supposedly after this London meeting that's now, well, partly canceled.
Right, so channels are still open, despite everything.
Although, Putin's spokesperson, Peskov, described the work with the Americans as, what was it, tense, complex, time-consuming.
Yeah, basically saying don't expect any quick public results. Gives you a sense of the mood.
Definitely fits with the lack of major breakthroughs so far. These are deep disagreements.
Now let's shift focus a bit.
Yeah.
Remember when President Trump was elected? There was a feeling in Moscow.
Yeah, hope, right, that he might broker a deal favorable to the Kremlin.
Exactly. A lot of expectation there, driven maybe by his deal-maker image and wanting a quick end to it.
But that was then. How's the view now, 3 months into his term?
Well, reports suggest noticeable disappointment in Moscow now. Quite a turnaround.
Disappointment? Why? Is it Trump's approach, or...?
Sources close to the Kremlin are apparently frustrated. With Trump's negotiation style, yes, but also with what they see as President Putin's inflexibility.
Interesting. So frustration on both sides of that dynamic, potentially. Internal Kremlin differences, maybe?
Could be. And adding to the tension, you have these warnings from Trump and his top diplomat.
About potentially walking away.
Yeah, withdrawing from the dialogue. And that's sparking fears that if talks fail, things could escalate. Hostilities could increase.
That's a serious concern. The idea of the U.S. stepping back leaves a big vacuum, a lot of uncertainty.
We heard from the Russian politician Grigory Yavlinsky, too.
Oh, right. The liberal figure. What's his take?
He feels progress towards peace is too slow. And he thinks Putin is basically trying to squeeze the maximum out of the situation before getting serious about talks.
Leveraging the current situation for a stronger negotiating position down the line. That's one interpretation.
And Putin's core demands, have they shifted at all?
It doesn't seem like it, based on reports. Still focused on Ukraine renouncing NATO membership.
And ceding significant territory. Those seem to be the long-standing conditions before Russia stops military actions.
And these are fundamental sticking points. Hard to see Ukraine agreeing to those easily, if at all.
And despite President Trump and his team warning they're losing patience,
Has it had any effect?
it's apparently very little. Putin is still reportedly refusing even that one-month ceasefire Ukraine agreed to back in March.
So the U.S. pressure isn't really moving the needle on Putin's core positions, it seems. He's holding firm.
Although Putin did announce that one-day Easter truce last Saturday.
Yes, the unilateral truce. How is that framed?
Ostensibly to show Russia's still interested in peace. Putin said Kyiv's response would reveal their desire and ability to actually negotiate a ceasefire.
So a gesture, but also putting the ball in Kyiv's court, trying to shape the narrative.
Pretty much. But Zelensky wasn't buying it. He called it another attempt by Putin to play with people's lives.
And did Ukraine observe the truce?
Zelensky didn't confirm they would. Shows the deep mistrust there.
Understandable. So given Trump's, let's say, sometimes critical stance on Ukraine and maybe some friction with U.S. allies,
Yeah.
is there a sense Putin feels more confident now that maybe Moscow can just win by outlasting Kyiv on the battlefield?
That's a grim assessment some are making, yeah. That Putin might be playing a long game, banking on attrition and perhaps weakening Western resolve.
While at the same time trying to keep Washington engaged in other ways.
Exactly. Reports suggest the Kremlin is trying to dangle prospects of, lucrative business deals.
Trying to keep Trump's goodwill, perhaps, separate from the battlefield situation.
Seems like a possible strategy. Keep Washington talking, even if it's about business, not just Ukraine.
It's a complex balancing act. Meanwhile, you had Secretary of State Rubio saying the U.S. might suspend peace efforts within days.
Right. And Trump himself suggesting if one side is obstructive, the U.S. might just move on. Strong words.
Definitely signals growing impatience, a willingness to potentially disengage if there's no progress soon.
But the Kremlin's reaction seems to be, not panicked.
Holding firm.
Yeah, indicating they're in no hurry for a deal, while still saying, we're open to dialogue. Playing the long game, perhaps.
And didn't Dmitry Medvedev say something even stronger?
He did, the former president. Suggested Moscow wouldn't mind if the U.S. did withdraw. Said Russia would just deal with everything faster.
Wow, that's quite assertive. Suggests confidence or maybe just a hardline view that U.S. involvement is hindering them.
It's striking. Meanwhile, you have polling data, like from the Levada Center.
The independent pollster.
Yeah, saying the Russian public generally welcomed Trump's return, mostly because of a hope for an end to hostilities.
So a real desire for peace among ordinary Russians, regardless of the high-level politics.
Seems so. Putin himself, he hasn't said a huge amount publicly about the conflict recently.
But there was that comment after visiting the Arctic submarine.
Ah, right. He said Russia was ready to finish them off, referring to Ukraine. Pretty stark language.
Contrasting messages then. Tough talk alongside diplomatic engagement.
And speaking of engagement, he hosted Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, again recently.
That was the third long meeting since February, wasn't it?
Yeah, multi-hour meetings. Shows persistent contact at that level, even if we don't know what's really being discussed or achieved.
And there have been other talks too, right?
Yes.
U.S. and Russian officials meeting elsewhere.
In Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the U.S. itself. But none seem to have led to any real breakthrough.
And the fighting, the missile strikes on cities, that hasn't let up.
No. Reports indicate the intensity remains pretty much unchanged. Diplomacy isn't translating to de-escalation on the ground yet.
Yet, despite all that, you had Vice President J.D. Vance saying on Friday the White House is still optimistic.
Yeah, optimistic about ending this brutal conflict seems a bit at odds with the lack of progress, doesn't it?
It could be projecting confidence, keeping up diplomatic momentum, maybe for domestic audiences too.
Possibly. But behind the scenes, we're hearing about some irritation within Kremlin-connected circles.
Oh, what kind of irritation?
That Putin's actually been more resistant to a ceasefire than some expected. That he seems determined to fight for full control of those 4 regions he annexed in 2022.
So maybe not everyone in Moscow is fully aligned with that approach, some wanting a quicker resolution.
That's the suggestion. Another source close to the Kremlin said that even after all these talks with Trump and Witkoff, Putin hasn't really signaled he's ready to stop fighting.
Not until his broader goals are met, like preventing more NATO expansion.
Exactly, suggesting it's not just about the territory within Ukraine, but these larger strategic security concerns for Russia.
Which makes finding a compromise even harder.
Definitely. A government-linked analyst in Moscow also said Putin hasn't shown the flexibility many expected on the future of those 4 regions.
Reinforcing that idea of a rigid stance on territory.
But this same analyst mentioned something else interesting. The Kremlin trying to diversify the negotiation portfolio.
Diversify how?
By trying to bring other issues into talks with the U.S. Things like energy, the Arctic, space exploration.
So trying to build bridges or maintain dialogue on other fronts, even if the Ukraine talks stall, keep the rapprochement alive somehow.
That seems to be the idea. Keep lines open, find common ground elsewhere.
Meanwhile, how are some in Russia viewing the U.S. impatience?
Some think it's mainly driven by U.S. domestic politics. Trump promised to end the conflict quickly during his campaign.
Do they think the U.S. pressure is more about fulfilling that promise and maybe a compromise is still possible?
That's the view some hold, yeah. That domestic pressure might eventually force a deal.
But not everyone sees it that way. Fyodor Voilovsky, head of that big Moscow institute.
IMO, yeah.
Right. He basically called Washington naive about the timeline, said everyone's just at the beginning of the road.
Implying this could take a lot longer than the U.S. seems to expect or want.
Exactly. And he was pretty blunt, saying Russia won't sacrifice its interests just to help Trump with his domestic politics.
And he added that warning.
The really stark one. If the U.S. pulls out of talks, Russia would basically have to create conditions for a diplomatic process through a new use of force.
Oof. That's a chilling statement, implying more fighting to force negotiations on Russia's terms.
It's a very hardline perspective. Now, circling back to Zelensky for a moment.
Right, he met Putin last October, urging a ceasefire. He'd been critical of the previous U.S. administration, too.
Yeah, felt they hadn't pushed negotiations hard enough. And he initially welcomed Trump's stated desire to end the fighting.
But his view has evolved.
It seems so. Now he's emphasizing that he doesn't think Trump is adequately addressing the future security of Europe.
Which Zelensky sees as essential for any real agreement.
Exactly. He thinks European nations need to be much more involved now. Sees a gap in the current U.S.-centric approach.
And his final assessment of the Trump administration's efforts.
Pretty critical. Said they seem to have general wishes for peace, but no clear idea how to actually get there, lacking a concrete plan.
Okay, so that brings us almost up to date. Let's look at the very latest moves. Secretary Rubio deciding not to go to the London talks.
Yeah, just decided on Tuesday. That definitely sent ripples, raised questions about the U.S. commitment level.
And at the same time, we hear Kyiv has rejected a key proposal from President Trump about halting hostilities.
Rejected. We don't know the details of the proposal, but Ukraine saying no is significant, shows the gaps remain wide.
So Rubio's out. Kyiv rejects a U.S. idea. Looks like a setback, right?
Definitely raises more questions about progress. But negotiators from the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine are still set to meet in London today.
Oh, they are? To keep working on ceasefire proposals.
Apparently so. So the diplomatic track isn't completely dead. Even with these challenges, the Europeans seem keen to keep it going.
But still, these two developments, Rubio skipping, Kyiv rejecting it, feels like a blow to hopes for a quick resolution to this 3-year conflict.
It absolutely underscores how fragile the whole process is. Massive obstacles remain.
And remember, Rubio was just in Paris last week.
Right, and after that meeting, he warned Trump was losing patience might shift to other priorities.
Reinforces that narrative of impatience. Seems consistent.
And according to European officials, what was briefed in Paris? What were the reported U.S. demands?
The same core issues. Insisting Ukraine recognize Crimea as Russian and renounce NATO membership. Still the major hurdles.
Which brings us back to Zelensky's statement on Tuesday.
Saying Ukraine is open to talks after a ceasefire, but rejecting any deal legitimizing Moscow's control over Crimea. Called it unconstitutional.
A firm red line for Kyiv. No compromise on that specific point.
Meanwhile, President Trump's rhetoric continues to fluctuate, doesn't it?
Yeah, from the end it in 24 hours promises to confidence, then frustration.
Like on Sunday, posting on social media that a deal could happen this week.
Which contrasts sharply with his earlier comments about walking away if there's no agreement.
Exactly. That inconsistency, it adds another layer of uncertainty.
And Rubio leaving Paris, his comment was pretty stark.
We're not going to keep doing this for weeks and months. Very clear signal of limited patience.
So who is representing the U.S. in London now?
The State Department confirmed General Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, will be there.
Okay, so still representation. What about Steve Witkoff, the Russia envoy?
His presence is uncertain for London, but he's apparently expected back in Moscow later this week. He's met Putin 3 times already since February.
So maintaining that direct channel to Putin while maybe reducing the visibility at the multilateral London talks. Interesting dynamic.
And it seems, under this pressure from Trump, both Russia and Ukraine have publicly said they're willing to negotiate.
Which is the first time since those failed talks way back in early 2022, right?
Exactly. So maybe, just maybe, this creates a new opening for diplomacy, with Trump having been the main driver recently.
A potential new platform, but clearly fraught with difficulties.
We saw that exchange too. Zelensky saying Monday he's ready for any conversation about a ceasefire stopping attacks on civilian infrastructure.
And Putin's response?
That the definition of a civilian target needs discussion. Maybe bilaterally, he suggested.
Highlighting absolutely critical point of detail and potential disagreement in any ceasefire. Who decides what's a legitimate target?
Peskov then clarified Putin meant bilateral talks with Ukraine, and added that Kyiv's latest ceasefire proposal has nuances that need discussion.
So Russia is looking at the details from Kyiv, suggesting some level of engagement there.
Right, and circling back to that Easter truce Putin called.
Seen as a gesture towards Trump, maybe pressure on Zelensky?
That was the interpretation. And despite the inevitable accusations of violations,
Ukrainian officials acknowledged things did quieten down a bit.
Yeah, a general decrease in the intensity of Russian attacks during that short period shows something is possible, even briefly.
Now, how did the State Department explain Rubio skipping London?
Downplayed it heavily. Spokesperson Tammy Bruce called it just logistics, scheduling issues, not a political statement.
Even though they'd previously confirmed his attendance and talked up the meeting's potential?
Exactly. Bit of spin control, perhaps, trying to minimize the perception of a policy shift or internal disagreement.
But the reduced U.S. presence, it could be seen as a setback for European efforts to get a bigger role, right?
You could see it that way, especially since Rubio himself had praised the UK, France, and Germany's constructive role in Paris.
And reps from those 3 are still expected in London, though Zelensky isn't going either.
Correct. So the format shifts again, raises questions about who's really driving things now.
But the UK seems keen to stay involved. Zelensky spoke with Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Monday.
Yeah, and Starmer is apparently trying to build this coalition of the willing other nations helping broker peace.
Proactive diplomacy from the UK, then.
Definitely. And according to Downing Street, Starmer reaffirmed unwavering UK support for Ukraine.
And backed Kyiv's call for a full ceasefire.
Yes, and said it's time for Putin to show he's serious about ending the war. A very strong, clear message from the UK.
So the diplomatic wheels keep turning, even amidst cancellations, disagreements, and shifting dynamics. A really complex picture.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.